Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. This video is the next in a series looking at the financial implications of Russia's invasion of Ukraine on the global economy. And in today's video, I want to talk about Cuba. And Cuba is another country that is now suffering because of the massive increases that we've seen in the price of food commodities and oil as a direct result of this war. As with a lot of the other countries that we've discussed, Cuba is a net importer of goods and therefore is entirely exposed to these global prices. And one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about Cuba today is that it is a country that has faced international sanctions for a very long period of time. And those sanctions have had a massive impact on the economy of Cuba. So as well as looking at what's going on right now today in Cuba, we'll also look at the sanctions that were imposed and what the implications of those were, and whether there's anything that we can apply to what's going on with Russia right now and the sanctions that are imposed against it. So we'll start off by having a very brief look at the history of Cuba, and I don't want to get into too much of the politics, so it will be a very brief history. We'll then look at the sanctions that have been applied against it. We'll have a look at what's going on with regards to oil, because Cuba does have its own oil reserves. We'll then talk about food and the economy. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my view as to what I think is likely to happen in Cuba over the next 3 to 6 months and what the impacts of that will be on the global economy. So before we get into all of that, as usual, if I could ask you to give me a thumbs up at some point during this video if you're enjoying the content, and please subscribe if you haven't done so already. I'm trying to get towards 100,000 subscribers, and I'm about 2/3 of the way there at the moment, but it'd be really great if I could get there at some point over the next few months. And if you'd like to support the channel, please have a look in the description below where you'll find the link to Buy Me a Coffee, Patreon and YouTube's Super Thanks feature. And I'm delighted to tell you that today's video is brought to you in conjunction with Atlas VPN. Cuba is the largest of all of the Caribbean islands and has a population of around 11 million people. And it's located relatively close to the southern tip of the Florida Peninsula. In terms of natural resources, Cuba does have oil reserves. However, it doesn't have enough to be able to feed its own population and therefore is still a net importer of oil. There are some mineral deposits on the island, the two largest being nickel and zinc, which are both exported. And the two main crops that are cultivated on the island are sugarcane and tobacco, and Cuba is famous for its cigars and its rum. In 1492, Christopher Columbus landed in Cuba and claimed it as part of the Spanish Empire, and it became the largest single producer of sugar for the Spanish Empire. In the late 19th century, control of the island briefly passed to the USA. However, in 1902, the country declared its independence. Cuba encountered a lot of political turmoil in the 1950s, and in 1959, Fidel Castro took over the country after the Cuban Revolution. At that time, there were a lot of American businesses that had operations in Cuba, including 3 major oil refineries that processed a lot of imported American oil. Fidel Castro declared his allegiance to communism and instructed these 3 refineries to start processing imported Russian oil in replacement of the American oil. The 3 refinery operators, Esso, Standard Oil and Shell, all refused to do this. Castro responded by nationalising all 3 of these refineries and offered no compensation to America, and he went on to nationalise all other American businesses in Cuba. At the start of 1961, President Eisenhower announced that all relations with Cuba were being cut under the Trading with the Enemy Act, and a variety of sanctions were imposed against the country. The vast majority of those sanctions are still in place today. President Carter eased the travel restrictions to Cuba slightly in 1977 when the travel ban was not renewed, and President Obama moved towards trying to improve relations with what was known as the Cuban Thaw in 2009. However, a lot of those efforts were subsequently cancelled out under President Trump. Prior to the imposition of the sanctions by the USA in the early 1960s, Cuba's largest trading partner was America. However, as soon as the sanctions were imposed, Cuba then became entirely reliant upon its relationship with the Soviet Union. Deals were put in place for the Soviets to buy large amounts of sugar from Cuba, and in exchange for this, they provided huge quantities of Russian oil. So as a direct result of both the sanctions being imposed and also the communist allegiance that Cuba declared, it became entirely dependent on the Soviet Union. and that led to Cuba cutting its ties with a lot of different countries around the world, and also to some of the aid agencies that it had previously been party to. Cuba had been one of the founding members of the International Monetary Fund. In 1956, it took a routine loan from the fund, and 2 years later it borrowed $12.5 million, which equated to around 25% of Cuba's quota. Under the terms of that loan, Cuba had to repay within 6 months. Repayment of the loan remained outstanding after Fidel Castro took over the country in 1959, and by 1963, the IMF's rules required its managing director to take action that would prohibit further use of the fund's resources. After a prolonged process of negotiations, Cuba renounced its membership in 1964. The outstanding loan was subsequently repaid. However, Cuba by that stage had burned its bridges and decided that it no longer wanted to have any sort of relationship with the IMF. And that is the situation that Cuba finds itself in today. It has no relationship with any of the aid agencies. So when we're talking about a country struggling financially and needing some form of bailout, Cuba at the moment doesn't have any options available to it. In the early 1960s, Cuba committed itself to the Soviet Union and was hoping that that long-standing relationship would see it through for the rest of time. Until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Cuba was provided with significant subsidies as well as substantial political and military support. The Soviet Union was the island's main trading partner, and this relationship guaranteed a minimum level of economic security and satisfaction of Cubans' basic needs. It's estimated that in the last 5 years of the 1980s, Soviet subsidies averaged $4.3 billion per year and constituted around 21% of the Cuban gross national product. Oil was sold to Cuba at below market prices, which allowed Cuba to re-export this commodity to the world markets and generate hard currency, which constituted around 40% of the country's total revenues, twice the value of the exports of sugar. The Soviet Union also bought large quantities of sugar directly from Cuba and paid significantly higher than the market price. It's estimated that it was around 6 times higher than what it could have sold in the international markets. When the Soviet Union was broken up in 1991, it plunged Cuba into a crisis which threatened to undo 35 years of social gains and economic achievements. The country lost its primary supplier of imported food, machinery and other goods, and was increasingly unable to purchase these goods from other sources as it lacked markets to export to. To make matters worse at that time, the US Congress tightened the embargo against Cuba and extended trade prohibitions and penalties to all foreign companies and subsidiaries of US entities. In response to what was happening, the Cuban government declared this to be a special period in a time of peace and implemented rationing schedules originally designed as a contingency for wartime. Shortages led to strict rationing of energy and food during this special period. Bread allocations decreased to 80 grams per person per day. Gasoline sales to individuals were suspended altogether, and other utility services were limited to a few hours a day, with blackouts lasting up to 20 hours. The government promoted cycling as a means of transportation and ox-based agriculture as an alternative to fossil fuels. By 1993, nearly half of the 1,200 buses in the capital Havana were idle due to lack of parts, and local taxi services disappeared. By 1994, nearly 700,000 bicycles had been distributed across the island. The disappearance of more than 300 medicines from local pharmacies, together with food shortages, threatened the health and nutrition of all sectors of the population. An estimated 800,000 cubic asthmatics were without necessary medicine. Cubans lost as much as 12 pounds on average. And by 1993, the levels of vitamin B in the nation were so low that 50,000 Cubans suffered from optic neuropathy. In order to address these issues, the government had no choice but to generate hard currency and rejoin international trade networks. The constitution was amended to allow private and corporate property, to invite foreign investment, and to turn state companies into for-profit enterprises and decriminalize the circulation of the US dollar. International tourism was identified as something that needed to be developed, and state companies remodeled old hotels and worked with international partners to build new ones. The airports of Cuba were also redeveloped near to beach areas to accommodate seasonal flight traffic from countries such as Canada and Germany. Before we go on any further, I want to talk about today's sponsor, Atlas VPN, and the incredible $1.99 3-year deal that they've offered on an exclusive basis to Joe Blogs viewers. So what is a VPN and why do you need it? Well, every time that you go onto the internet, you leave a virtual footprint, and you run the risk of being hacked or spied upon. A virtual private network makes all your internet traffic travel through an encrypted tunnel and protects you from spying, public Wi-Fi dangers, and hides your IP address and online activities. So VPNs are a great idea from a security perspective because it means when you go online, you can't be hacked. But they're also really useful for a variety of other reasons. An Atlas VPN enables you to change the location of your device, which is handy for a couple of reasons. Firstly, if you do any travelling and you go outside of your local area, you can still access all of your services that rely upon you being in your home country. And I recently went on holiday and was able to watch soccer matches whilst I was abroad that normally I wouldn't have been able to get access to. But they also enable you to set up memberships and subscriptions in countries outside of your home location. And this offers you the potential for major cost savings on international brands. So please have a look at the link in the description below, and you've got a 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you're not happy, you can cancel the service within 30 days. As mentioned earlier, Cuba is a net importer. The value of goods exported by Cuba is around $1.1 billion, but it's importing around $3.4 billion. The top exports by value are tobacco, with around $270 million worth of sales, sugar at $200 million, nickel 140 million, alcohol around 80 million, and zinc at 70 million. In terms of the goods imported, the official register only shows food items, with poultry equating to around $270 million, wheat 140 million, corn a similar level, concentrated milk around 130 million, and rice about 70 million. Now, the biggest single item that's not showing on this balance of trade for Cuba is oil. And Cuba needs to import around 100,000 barrels of oil per day to be able to fuel its electricity power stations. And the reason that it's not showing on the balance of trade is that historically Cuba has paid for its oil on a barter system in exchange for goods and services. Cuba is reliant on imports for around 70% of all of the food in the country. As we've just discussed, the largest categories of imports are poultry, wheat, corn, milk, and rice. So let's have a look at what's happened to the price of all of those items over the last few months. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, let's see what the movements have been. Poultry prices have more than doubled since the start of the pandemic and are up around 50% since the start of the war. As you'll know if you follow the channel, wheat prices have almost doubled since the start of the war. The price of corn is up more than 50%. International rice prices are also up around 50%. And milk prices are up around 10%. So the bottom line for Cuba is that the price of all of the main items that they are reliant upon and that they're importing have all gone up significantly since the start of the war. And it's reported that Cubans spend around 80% of all of their income on food items. But it's not just the price of food that's a problem for Cuba, it's the sheer availability and shortages. The main supermarkets in Cuba are state-owned, and these supermarkets are now running seriously short of basic food items. There are some privately owned stores, but a lot of those stores will only accept foreign currency. They won't take Cuban peso. The exchange rate for the Cuban peso has been set at 24 pesos to $1. However, in the black markets, the peso is trading for around 110 pesos to $1. Now, the US dollar is not officially accepted in all of the state-run supermarkets. However, it is used commonly amongst the population, and there is a relatively high level of dollarization in the country. As I mentioned earlier, Cuba has oil reserves. And the industry was developed post-World War II in conjunction with a lot of the American majors. But following the Fidel Castro regime taking over and the relationship souring with the US, those majors all left and the Cuban oil industry was nationalised. As a direct result of the presence of oil on the island, electricity generation on the island was focused on using oil. And around 2/3 of all electricity generated in Cuba is thermoelectric. During the period of the strong relationship with the Soviet Union, this worked very well, as Cuba was provided with an abundance of Russian oil, which it was able to use some of for its own sources and sell on the balance for a huge profit. However, the reliance on oil for electricity generation proved a problem in the 90s after the breakup of the Soviet Union, and this led to extensive periods of blackouts in Cuba. After a significant period of problems, a new relationship was established between Cuba and Venezuela in the early 2000s. And Venezuela is the country that has the largest reserves of oil globally and has had problems finding trading relationships because of the political history of the country. Another barter deal, similar to the deal that was put in place with the Soviets, was established between Cuba and Venezuela. Cuba got access to free oil in exchange for sending educated people such as doctors, coaches, intelligence advisors and military advisors to Venezuela. Venezuela was providing around 100,000 barrels of oil a day in exchange for Cuban doctors setting up clinics for the poor in Venezuela's most downtrodden neighborhoods, and thousands of Venezuelans traveled free of charge to Havana for medical treatment of everything from cataracts to gunshot wounds. The oil coming from Venezuela allowed Cuba to pay off some long-standing debts and to revamp the island's fading tourist industry. The workers for oil deal generated more income than rum, cigars or anything else that Cuba produced. The people of Cuba therefore became its main export, and it was common to see Cuban workers returning from Venezuela carrying expensive items such as flat-screen TVs. However, unfortunately for Cuba, a major downturn in the Venezuelan economy started in 2017, and from that time onwards, the supply of oil has reduced significantly and is now down to around 50,000 barrels of oil per day, compared with the 100,000 at its peak. And this is a major problem for Cuba because they are still reliant on that oil for the generation of electricity, and they simply don't have any money or foreign currency to be able to buy oil in the international markets. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because Cuba is clearly suffering as a result of what's going on in Ukraine. We have got a major increase in food prices and oil prices, and they are the main commodities that Cuba has to import. It is entirely reliant upon import of food to feed its population, and it needs foreign currency in order to buy that food. And the problem that Cuba has is that it doesn't really generate enough foreign currency to be able to do that. Now, in the past, it relied upon a barter system. It was essentially a satellite state of the Soviet Union and was being given a lot of free oil and other items which it could then monetize and also use for its own purposes. So during that period, Cuba was funded entirely by the Soviet Union. When that arrangement finished in the early 1990s, the economy was thrown into chaos, and it took a long period of time for the authorities to try to work something out. The arrangement that they put in place with Venezuela was a similar sort of barter arrangement that they had with the Soviet Union. However, this arrangement was focused on the expertise of the people of Cuba going and providing services that Venezuela didn't have, that they couldn't get. So they exchanged people for oil. And that relationship worked until the Venezuelan economy got into difficulty, and now they're struggling to be able to supply a similar amount of oil. So Cuba has been struggling for a long period of time in terms of balancing its books. And where we are right now is a really critical period for the island because they don't have any large reserves of currency. They don't have any real means of being able to generate any currency, and they don't have anybody that they can turn to in terms of a bailout. So the relationships that they were working on over the last 50 or 60 years have really been based on the communist socialist ideology of helping out fellow countries. But unfortunately, that isn't going to see them through this particular crisis. They will need some hard cash to be able to buy in the food to feed the population, and also to buy in oil to keep electricity running and to prevent any blackouts. And the problem that Cuba has right now is that it doesn't have a lot of friends who are looking to help them out. It was formerly a member of the IMF, but unfortunately it's relinquished its membership and the relationship has soured, and it doesn't really have anybody to turn to. So it's now having to come up with creative ideas as to how it gets itself out of this situation. And those ideas are going to have to be really creative because as it sits right now, the future looks bleak for Cuba. They need to buy food, they don't have any money, and they don't really have any friends in the world as it sits right now. And the other reason that I wanted to post this video is to look at whether or not the sanctions that have been imposed against Cuba by the USA have put them into this situation, and whether it's likely that a similar sort of scenario could occur for Russia. So the two countries that I've just been talking about, Cuba and Venezuela, are two countries that have been sanctioned by the US. And Venezuela has also been sanctioned by a variety of other countries. And that's led to a restriction in the amount of trade that Venezuela can do. And the economy is now starting to implode and really suffer. And that is a direct result of those sanctions. The Cuban situation is slightly different because it's just sanctions from the US. So you've still got relationships with Canada and Europe, and we still have a lot of tourists that go there from those areas. But the US has really caused Cuba a major problem because it was its closest trading ally in the past, and by cutting those ties, it's damaged the economy of Cuba. And there is a really strong possibility, I think, that what's happening right now with Russia could result in a similar sort of scenario. Not as extreme because it's much larger than Venezuela and Cuba in terms of the economy and the amount of resources that it has. But in terms of reducing trading partnerships and your options, that is not good for business. So Russia now is going to be more reliant upon its relationship with China and some of the other Asian countries. But if it then hits a difficulty in that relationship, in the same way that Cuba hit a difficulty with the Soviet Union, then you really are stranded. You've got nowhere else to turn. And that's really the learning point here, that Cuba painted itself into a corner, firstly with the Soviet Union, and secondly with Venezuela, really because it didn't have any other options. And as soon as those relationships died, Cuba is now very isolated and really exposed and at risk of a huge humanitarian disaster. And Russia could well be getting itself into a similar situation. It's reducing its number of trading partners, and if it then suddenly finds that the relationship with one or two of those key partners, like China, doesn't go to plan, then they will be exposed and isolated and could find themselves in a world of pain. So it probably won't happen overnight, but there is a really big risk for Russia going forward that they could find themselves in a much, much worse situation in 5 or 10 years' time than they are right now. So hopefully you found this video useful, informative and educational. If you've liked what I've said today, then please give me a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so already. Hey guys, just a very, very brief update on Joe Blogs 2. We are very, very close now. I just had a look right now and it was 3,973 hours on the clock. So hopefully we will go through that 4,000 hour mark very, very soon. It may already have happened by the time I've posted this video, but just in case it hasn't, please jump over to the channel, watch one or two of the videos just to get us through that last portion of the watch time. And then we're at the point where I can apply for monetization and then we can start this experiment for real. So if you are making some videos, thinking of making some videos, now's the time to crack on with that. Start polishing them up, get them into a finished state, and then contact me through the About section on the channel and we can talk about how we can get your video up there, and let's see whether or not we can get some significant views for some of these videos. So thanks for watching this part of the video and thanks for watching this whole video all the way through to the end.